The cafeteria smelled of stale coffee and warm bread cooling on metal trays. A thin line of sunlight cut across a scratched laminate table where a little girl sat with her lunchbox closed like a secret chest. Her braids smelled faintly of shampoo and orange juice. Her small fingers tapped the lid as if counting invisible coins. She lifted the lid and pretended to serve plates, moving toys of imagination across an empty square of plastic. Across the room, a man in a wool coat and a watch that caught the light like a small sun sat alone, hands folded over a leather folder and a coffee gone cold. Jonathan Hale had built skyscrapers and charities, been on magazine covers and dinner panels, and he had never been served a scene like that in any boardroom. When the girl unfolded a crumpled note and read it aloud in a voice that shook only little by little, the words landed like stones into a quiet pond. "I am sorry there is no sandwich today. I will try again tomorrow. Love, Mom." Nothing in his spreadsheets had prepared him for that line. What would you feel if you heard a sentence like that and knew, somehow, you were connected to it? Stay with this story, because what came next would change a routine, force a reckoning, and alter how an entire company measured success. Tell us in the comments what you would do if you were in his place. The first exchange happened like a small earthquake. The girl closed her lunchbox as if tucking away a confession. Carla, the school lunch manager, smelled of garlic and lemon from the kitchen and wiped her hands on an apron that had seen better days. She crossed the floor slowly and crouched, putting a hand on the table so the linoleum clicked under her nails. "Evelyn, what did the paper say?" she asked. Evelyn looked up, cheeks flushed. "Mama said she could not get the bus to the pantry," she said. "She said we would have cereal, but there was none." The sentence floated, and the cafeteria seemed to inhale. "Show me," Carla said. Evelyn handed over the note, the edges already softened by being folded and unfolded. Carla read the single line, then looked over at the man in the wool coat and felt something like a current pass through the room. Jonathan had come to the school that morning for a press tour, a parade of good news they had arranged with his foundation. He had not planned to enter a lunch line. "Excuse me," he said, rising as if pulled by a wire. "Is there a problem?" His voice was practiced, courteous. Carla straightened. "We have kids who go without some days, sir," she said, naming a truth she had learned to keep quiet. "We try our best, but budgets and supply logistics sometimes fail us." The man with the leather folder looked at the note. Again, then at Evelyn, then at the rows of children whose plates were more full than some of their nights had been. He felt a pressure in his chest that was not just sympathy. "My team manages several school initiatives," he said. "I thought we were covering this." A teacher named Roberto, who kept the recess whistle in his pocket and smelled of chalk and rain, stepped forward with a frown. "You did not this district." The room showed its seams. The air tasted like metal and sugar. Outside, a bus hissed to a stop and a dog barked, indifferent. In the small theater of the cafeteria, the incongruity between polished charity and ordinary absence had become visible. Jonathan had been invited to the school that day by Leah Ramos, a community organizer, who carried flyers and a worn handbag that always smelled like peppermint and printer ink. She wanted photographs of a billionaire offering empathy to a neighborhood that had been written off in development plans years earlier. Leah believed in optics, but she also believed in obligations. She watched the exchange with an expression that balanced hope and suspicion. "If you have a moment, Mr. Hale," she said, voice clear. "This is not an anecdote. It is part of a pattern. Your company closed a plant 2 years ago that many of these families relied on. Unemployment, reduced services, strain on families. We need a conversation, not a photo op." The press person with the camera, Marta, with a camera strap that smelled of leather and something floral, hovered and asked for a ready smile. Jonathan felt his training in public gestures react as his chest unclenched into a defensive posture. "I want to understand," he said. "Show me the numbers." Roberto scoffed. "Numbers will not show you the empty bowls." The tension became audible. Spoons ticked on plates like a metronome for the moral tempo of the room. The scene had the clarity of a sentence, a note, a lunchbox, a billionaire confronted by the human result of choices his company had made. He promised, then. It was small at first. He placed his leather folder on a table and spoke quietly, almost as if making a private vow. "I will look into this personally," he said, and the words landed heavier than the polished watch on his wrist. "I will come back without cameras. I will find out where the breakdown happened, and I will fix what we can." For a person who measured time in quarters and returns, this sounded like a risk. His assistant, Marcus Lee, with his precise hair and a briefcase that smelled faintly of cologne, raised an eyebrow as if counting potential liabilities. "Are you making a public statement?" he murmured. Jonathan shook his head. "No, this is not for show." He felt the start of something in his sternum, a tug of responsibility that did not have a line item. Carla squeezed Evelyn's shoulder, and the child smiled with teeth that showed both resilience and moments of hardship. "If you mean it," Carla said, "then come and meet the mothers. Hear them." Jonathan folded his hands, and in that gesture there was a decision to leave the safety of his tower and walk into kitchens with chipped tiles and unpaid bills. The cafeteria hummed with the sound of a decision forming, a soft electric crackle that promised change or at least conflict. What followed was an investigation that was personal in a way corporate audits rarely were. Jonathan took a slow drive through neighborhoods his publicists had once labeled inconvenient for corporate campaigns. He smelled exhaust and laundry detergent, tasted the dust of unpaved sidewalks in the air. He walked into a small apartment where Maria, Evelyn's mother, kept a kettle that whistled with a thin, persistent song and a pantry with a single bag of rice. Maria had worked on the plant line for 15 years until the company had closed the facility due to consolidation and automation. Her backstory unfolded in 3 paragraphs, like a map of the everyday. She had grown up learning to stretch a paycheck like a thin sheet of paper. Her father taught her carpentry and how to read schedules so that bread could be bought on days the market discounted it. She married at 20 and had Evelyn at 27. After the plant closure, she took 3 jobs in 2 years: washing dishes, folding clothes at a laundromat, and cleaning offices at night. Her wages were intermittent, taxed by exhaustion. The eviction notices piled until her neighbor, Anita, with a cat named Nimbus, organized a small fundraiser that bought a space heater for the winter. Maria feared for Evelyn's future because she had seen the college applications of friends collapse into letters of resignation and relocations. She kept a tiny photograph of her mother pinned to a corkboard, a reminder of resilience. Her pride kept her from taking some public aids out of a sense of not wanting charity. The decision to hand Evelyn a note was made on a morning when the pantry shelves were bare and pride ran thinner than peanut butter. Jonathan's own backstory arrived in measured sentences, 3 paragraphs that traced a different kind of route. He had been a child in a 3-room apartment in a town far from glass towers. His mother had taught him to count coins and fold them into origami cranes for luck. He had been the first in his family to go to university and stayed late at libraries that smelled of ink and lemon polish. When he had made his first successful venture, he invested in factories because they had provided him steady apprenticeships once upon a time. He remembered the pride in the foreman's nods when schedules were met, the rhythm of assembly lines that meant paychecks came on time. As the company scaled, mergers had been a pragmatic answer and layoffs a spreadsheet inevitability. He had defended those choices and earnings calls, arguing for efficiency and competitiveness. Over years, he had given to causes and sat on panels about corporate social responsibility. He had told himself that philanthropy could undo harms his business choices caused. But somewhere between the boardroom and the plant, faces had blurred into metrics. The image of a little girl pretending a meal called him back to a memory of his mother unfolding a meager sandwich and teaching him how to savor small things. That memory carried weight like a contraband object from another life. It made the arithmetic of layoffs a human story again. The discovery that linked his decisions to Maria's hardships involved a trail of documents as thin and cruel as a paper trail of excuses. In a back office lit by a lamp that hummed and smelled faintly of printer toner, Marcus and Jonathan sifted through quarterly reports and notices. Marcus tapped keys, and the air around him had the metallic tang of worry. "We closed Plant 7 in Hightown," he said, reading aloud a memo that had been stored under layers of other memos. "We outsourced assembly to a facility overseas 6 months later." The voice in the lamplight repeated the sequence of decisions like a script. Another file showed the company had taken government incentives that required no clause for worker retraining in this region. "We assumed unemployment would be temporary," Jonathan said. His voice had a brittle quality. The files smelled of dust and official avoidance. He read a letter from a former human resources manager who had tried to increase transition funds and been shelved by a cost projection. That projection had been cold and precise and had never asked what would happen to children who once had lunch every day. The linkage was simple and devastating. The decision to close a plant had reduced local incomes and stretched social services until pantries emptied. When the reality of that sentence hit Jonathan, he felt like someone who had ignored a leak in a dam until the water found the window and flooded the nursery. The sensation was not only moral but practical. He had to move from apology to remedy. The dilemma that followed felt like standing at a crossroads with different storms approaching. Friends from his board warned about precedent and lawsuit risk. Board members with clipped voices and expensive shoes muttered about shareholder expectations and market reactions. "You cannot let emotion override fiduciary duty," said Avery Collins, an investor who always smelled faintly of aftershave and old money. "We need to protect assets." Jonathan listened, and his hands rubbed absently at his chin, the skin rough from too many late nights. He went into a room alone and sat with a cup of coffee that tasted like paper and expectations. Memories of his own early years offered a counter-argument. He imagined Evelyn growing into an adult who remembered either a system that abandoned her or people who repaired things. The moral weight was thick. The decision required him to reconcile profit with people. He considered quietly reallocating funds to emergency programs, a fixable number. He also thought about institutional changes, rewriting procurement policies, adding clauses to future consolidations that required retraining or community investment, creating a bridge fund to support displaced workers until placements could be found. Each option had trade-offs. He imagined the boardroom again and the sound of arguments rising like wind in a canyon. He also imagined Maria in her kitchen, the kettle whistling and that note folded into a pocket. The tension concentrated into a single choice. He chose to make a public promise in private. He would convene a meeting, and he would ask the people who had been affected to be there. The decision translated into an institutional action that felt messy and real. Jonathan called an emergency meeting and assembled his senior team in a room where the light fell in sharp rectangles across a long table. There were coffee stains at the edges and a whiteboard still smelling of marker. The meeting was a dialogue of 10 parts, each exchange a notch in the turning of policy. Jonathan began, voice measured. "We are responsible for outcomes we did not foresee," he said. Marcus adjusted his tie and replied, "We must be strategic. Where does our obligation end?" Leah, who had been invited into the room for this session because Jonathan insisted on community presence, said plainly, "Our obligation is to people who were affected because of choices the company made. That includes retraining funding and emergency meal programs." Dr. Anika Shah, a policy advisor wearing glasses that reflected the data on a tablet and whose notes smelled of ink and jasmine, added, "We can implement a 3-part plan: immediate relief, medium-term workforce transition, and structural safeguards. But we need measurable targets and a timeline." "How do we measure employment outcomes in 6 months?" Marcus asked. "What metrics satisfy investors and communities?" Jonathan responded with a softness that surprised him. "We will not let metrics hide stories. We will publish employment placement rates, hours of training delivered, and the number of children receiving daily meals in affected schools." Leah interjected, And transparency, community steering groups, names and faces, not just numbers. A board member named Susan, whose voice usually ducked behind legal phrasing, queried about liability. Jonathan looked at every person in the room, names echoing. Avery Collins, Marcus Lee, Dr. Anika Shah, Leah Ramos, Susan Patel, Roberto from the schools, who had been invited as a witness, and Marta, the press photographer, who had insisted on attending despite distancing herself from PR. "We will risk criticism from some," he said, "but we will also create a program that prevents avoidable harm. We must choose courage in this instance." The room hummed with conflict and possibility. The plan took shape with clauses explained in plain language so locals could understand. Funds would be allocated to school meals immediately. Retraining programs would be offered with a priority for former plant workers, and future consolidation would be contingent on a community impact assessment. The procedural explanation that followed was compact and precise. The program would provide emergency meal funding for up to 6 months in each affected district, create vocational partnerships with 2 community colleges, and set aside a transition fund equal to 5% of estimated savings from plant closures to be used for community stabilization. In practical terms, this meant funds would be dispersed through school districts and community organizations. Worker outreach would begin within a week, and an independent audit would publish results every 3 months. The description made legalists nod and community leaders breathe. Implementation began at dawn in a flurry of practical movements and sensory moments. Trucks arrived in a gust of diesel smell and dust. Volunteers wore gloves that smelled of latex and salt from sweat. Carla stood by the kitchen door and directed deliveries with a clipboard that had coffee rings and her name written in a handwriting that had once been neat but had loosened under strain. The program required people. Leah coordinated community outreach and knocked on doors with a list that rattled in her hand. Roberto organized schedules and supervised lunch lines. Marta photographed discreetly for documentation. Officer Jensen ensured safety during distributions and spoke to mothers in a voice that balanced authority and softness. Principal Alvarez organized classroom shifts so that breakfasts and lunches would not be missed. Anita, the neighbor who ran a local mother's circle and had Nimbus the cat balanced on her hip, organized volunteers and transported foodstuffs. Each name became a thread in the new network. The first distribution day tasted of hot soup and damp cardboard. Jonathan stood at a folding table with a ladle in his hand and his suit sleeves rolled up, the fabric smelling faintly of starch and nervousness. He ladled soup as if practicing humility. Evelyn came with a wide, small grin and a spoon in her hand, and when Jonathan handed her a bowl, she looked at him as if he were a character in a story who had stepped into the wrong chapter and then decided to stay. People lined up, and the program registered names and needs in notebooks that smelled of ink and the damp of fingers. The sensory array was full. The clang of pots, the sweetness of oranges in a box, the tactile roughness of paper intake forms, the metallic ping of a cash box that would not be used because funds were now digital. A young man named Carlos, a former line worker who smelled of motor oil and had a scar on his knuckle from years of hard work, came forward and said quietly, "I was worried about my daughter." He hugged someone, and the community breathed together. 3 moments of tension punctuated the rollout, and each required careful narration. The first came when a contractor sent to handle procurement tried to reroute higher quality supplies to more profitable districts, leaving local schools with lesser goods. The community discovered substitute cans that had dented labels and missing expiration dates. Voices rose in the distribution hall. "This is not what we agreed," Leah said, fury like a low drumbeat. The contractor's manager, slick and angry, insisted on logistics. Jonathan stepped in, hands open and palms up, and negotiated a swap even as his own team complained about cost overruns. The scene stretched for paragraphs as the emotional stakes were visible in mothers' faces and in the children's hesitant plates. The negotiation took time and left a residue of distrust that required outreach with named community leaders to repair. The second moment of tension arrived when union representatives demanded guarantees for rehiring that the company could not legally bind without breaching contracts with other subsidiaries. In a meeting smelling of stale coffee and hard decisions, Dr. Annika Shah and Marcus argued with union spokespeople about feasible commitments. Tempers cooled when Maria, who had been invited as a representative voice, spoke about knights counting coins and the shame of a child with an empty plate. Her testimony reframed the negotiation from abstract clauses to human urgency. The third moment of tension occurred when press coverage framed the program as a philanthropic gesture rather than a corporate responsibility. Headlines in some outlets reduced the narrative to a single image: Jonathan handing a bowl of soup and a quote about personal growth. Community members felt erased. Leah demanded transparency, and a corrections meeting was arranged. Jonathan agreed to an on-camera conversation with community leaders so their voices would not be lost again. Each of these tensions required slow, careful repair and became lessons in accountability and listening. The personal transformation in Jonathan unfolded in small, intimate scenes. He began to visit kitchens and homes without aides or photographers. He learned to boil rice the way Maria did and found he could taste when it was slightly underdone, a small but humbling sensation. He came to a mother's circle in a community center that smelled of marker and boiled coffee and listened. In one evening scene, 8 people traded stories around a folding table, and the dialogue between Jonathan and Maria stretched into 10 exchanges over the course of an hour. "Why did you leave?" Jonathan asked, voice low. "We had to," Maria replied, fingertips tracing a seam in her sleeve. "They closed the plant and said there were efficiencies. No training was offered." "Did anyone tell you about options?" he asked. "No," she said, anger and weariness woven into the syllables. "They handed us a packet and a number." "What would help you most now?" he asked. "A steady job," she said, "a promise that someone will not forget us." "What can I do that would matter?" he asked, genuine and uncertain. "Create jobs nearby," she said. "Fund childcare so we can attend training. Pay attention to the small things, like bus routes." "I will listen to what you say," he promised. "Hold me accountable," he said. "Name me when I fail." She smiled slightly. "We will," she said. "But we will also notice when you keep your word." The scene was tactile: the scrape of a chair, the smell of baked bread someone had brought, the warmth of a cup pressed between palms. Jonathan felt himself shift in subtle ways. His measurements of success began to include faces on a list and the rhythm of a child's laugh in a classroom. The transformation was not instantaneous. It was a series of small moments in which empathy was practiced and responsibility was made visible. Secondary characters wove through the story with recognizable actions that made the narrative alive. Carla continued to serve with a steady hand and organized meal menus and volunteer routes. Roberto supervised playground activities and kept the whistle ready if the line of students grew unruly. Marta compiled photographic evidence that told the story of people rather than corporate PR. Officer Jensen coordinated safe transit for food trucks and ensured distributions passed without incident. Anita organized the mothers, baked loaves for fundraising events, and drove elderly neighbors to appointments. Dr. Annika Shah drafted policy language and translated legalese into accessible bullet points that communities could understand. Marcus Lee adjusted budgets and frequently rubbed his eyes in long nights of spreadsheet realignment. Susan Patel drafted legal frameworks that permitted safeguards without overexposing the company to lawsuits. Each of these people performed concrete tasks that together formed the scaffolding of change. There were technical process explanations offered in plain language so the community would understand how funds would flow and how retraining would work. The company would create a 3-pillar approach, with immediate meal funding to districts, a midterm vocational training program with guaranteed interviews for those completing a standardized curriculum, and long-term policy safeguards requiring community impact assessments prior to future plant closures. Money would be dispersed through school district accounts and local nonprofit partners using transparent ledgers accessible to community steering committees. Training would be coordinated with 2 community colleges offering modular certificates and apprenticeships that aligned with existing regional industries. Reporting would be quarterly and published in plain English, with data points on meals provided, participants enrolled in training, hours delivered, and placements achieved. This explanation was short and precise to ensure comprehension and trust. There were moments of tension inside Jonathan, too, quiet ones that did not make headlines. He would stand at night in his living room smelling faintly of his late father's pipe tobacco and think about the calculus that had once guided his choices. He worried about precedent and investor reaction, but he worried more about the faces he had seen. Each mimetic worry required pacing and conversation. At a particularly fraught board session, accusations flew about misallocated resources and brand damage. The room felt like a furnace of competing priorities. Marcus argued for controlled pilots. Leah demanded immediate action. Dr. Annika Shah insisted on measurement. Jonathan felt the pressure compress into his chest and then breathe out into a final stance. They would pilot in affected districts and commit resources publicly. It was not a surrender to emotion, but a strategic recalibration. The choice to do so cost him some votes in the short term, but shifted corporate culture over the long term. As the program took root, local effects were palpable and sensory in day-to-day life. Children began arriving to school wet from rain, but with full stomachs and backpacks that smelled of new books and lemon polish. Attendance improved, and teachers reported higher engagement as the sweetness of hunger removed a heavy fog that had kept some students listless. Elena, a teacher who wore colorful scarves and left notes in students' lunchboxes that smelled faintly of lavender, noticed that a child named Tomas stopped falling asleep in class. A small bakery run by Anita began supplying loaves for community breakfasts, and her ovens filled the morning with yeasty warmth that felt like a tiny reclamation. A small bike repair shop hired 2 former plant mechanics because the retraining program matched their skills to local needs. The narrative of change included numbers. Within 3 months, the program had funded over 8,000 meals across the district, enrolled 420 adults in vocational programs, and had a placement rate of 63% for those completing training modules. Names became evidence. Maria found a part-time position as a line manager at a community packaging facility, and Carlos returned to work in a regional supply shop with steady hours. The community dinner, where Jonathan sat with a roast that tasted of rosemary and shared stories, became emblematic of a relationship rearranged. There were additional moments of high tension that tested accountability. A supplier falsely claimed compliance with new quality standards, and a batch of food supplies had to be returned. The press smelled of scandal, and the trust built on small acts threatened to erode. Leah organized a town hall where mothers voiced their frustrations in a room smelling of paint and old coffee. Jonathan listened as accusations rolled and as tears were offered like raw testimony. He responded slowly, naming failures and promising corrective action. A third tension arose when a local politician attempted to co-opt the program for campaign imagery. Leah confronted him publicly and insisted the program remain community-led. Each challenge required transparent responses, named corrections, and sometimes public apologies that felt uncomfortable but necessary. The seeds of trust grew not because promises had been made, but because promises were kept and reinforced by visible results. The transformation extended beyond the immediate community to the board and corporate practices. The company instituted a community impact clause that required consultation and retraining funds before any plant consolidation. They created a community advisory council that included residents like Anita, educators like Roberto, and workers like Carlos. Quarterly audits measured both economic and social outcomes and were posted online. Jonathan began to measure success differently. He asked his executives to visit a school at least once a quarter and to report back with notes about real people. He no longer considered philanthropy an offset for corporate harm. He considered it a responsibility integrated into decision-making. In a private conversation, Susan said, "This is uncomfortable but important." Marcus admitted to new respect for ground-level reality. The company changed policy and culture in ways that would take years to fully manifest. It was an institutional reorientation that did not erase past harm but sought to prevent repetition.
The epilogue traced the small but measurable arc of impact in 3 time points. 1 month later, the immediate relief had normalized. The meals were flowing, attendance held steady, and the community steering committee had published the first ledger in plain language. The ledger showed that 2,400 emergency meals had been provided in that month, that 80 families had received grocery vouchers, and that a hotline had been established for assistance. Maria had begun evening classes in basic computer literacy that smelled of paper and new pencil erasers. Evelyn had a new lunchbox with a cartoon fox and a note from her mother that read more confidently, "Thank you for helping." 3 months later, the midterm programs showed progress. 420 adults were enrolled in vocational training with partners at 2 colleges. Placement rates hovered at 63%, and a community garden program organized by Anita provided fresh produce to school cafeterias. The company disclosed the first community impact assessment, which led to an immediate contract revision for procurement practices. Local businesses like the bakery and a small logistics firm owned by Carlos had seen revenue increases and hired additional staff. Jonathan visited a classroom that smelled like crayons and orange juice and watched a reading circle where children read aloud with less anxiety and better concentration. 6 months later, the structural shifts had begun to manifest more broadly. The company had implemented a binding policy framework requiring community consultation prior to closures. 3 pilot projects for apprenticeships turned into longer-term partnerships with regional manufacturers and tech firms. The quarterly audits published details: over 8,000 meals, 1,200 participants in training programs across several districts, and a 72% placement rate in industries with growth potential. Maria had a full-time job and a small savings account. She had registered for a continuing education scholarship funded partially by the company program. Evelyn had improved grades, and a teacher named Elena observed a marked increase in class participation. The Community Advisory Council had the authority to review major consolidation plans, and local leaders now had a voice that could not be easily ignored. These numbers were not simply metrics, they were evidence that decisions made with people in mind altered trajectories. The conclusion knit the emotional thread into action. The lunchbox that had started as a private act of necessity became a public symbol of accountability. Where once a note had been folded and kept in secret, community meetings now displayed lists of commitments, and people who had been named were included in decisions. Jonathan admitted, in a statement with a voice that had learned humility, that wealth without presence had felt incomplete. He began to measure success not only in returns, but in returned dignity. The company institutionalized not a one-off gesture, but a sustained program that sought structural prevention. The result for the community was tangible: regular meals, retraining opportunities, and a sense among parents that their children might see a different future. Names mattered. Maria regained steady employment and began saving for a certificate program. Carlos bought a used door for his small workshop and hired an apprentice. Leah continued to insist on transparency and accountability, proving that community vigilance was vital to sustain change. For those watching this story, the lesson was practical and clear. Responsibility required presence, not just money. If this story moved you, share in the comments what action you think your own community could take to make institutions more accountable. Write one sentence: "I will." Each comment helps surface ideas and creates a commons of responsibility. If you want more stories that trace the arc from injustice to practical repair, subscribe to this channel. We tell stories of people and systems, not just headlines. We will keep sharing how small acts of accountability ripple into policy, and how listening can become a mechanism for change. Remember that responsibility is a practice and not only a sentiment. Today, notice someone, speak for a neighbor, or support an initiative that demands accountability. The lunchbox that once held a crumpled note now sits on a shelf in a small school library, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that choices have faces, and that when those faces are seen, systems can change.